Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black Sheep Tribune podcast. My name is T. Gideon, and I am your host. And here I cover true crime cases that you may have never heard of because every case matters. Before we get into today's case, I just want to say that I can't even really describe how happy and how excited I am to be sitting down in front of a camera and filming an episode for you guys. Filming and having the video aspect of the podcast up somewhere is something that I have been wanting to do ever since I started the podcast a few years ago. So I am just so happy to even be at this point and have everything set up to where I can actually do this now. Not much has changed for me personally since the last time I sat down to film something or record something for you guys, except for the fact that I now use he, him pronouns and I identify as a trans man. But other than that, nothing super new that I can really think of. And so, okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about today's case just before we go ahead and jump into it. So it's the Ronnie O'Neal case. If you have heard anything about this case, I'm sure you've probably just seen clips of him screaming at everyone in the courtroom, during the trial. I know that was, I think, the most popular video from this case that actually went viral and got 1 million views. So if you've seen anything about the case, it's probably that. But there are a lot of other interesting and strange things that happen in this case that I really haven't seen pop up anywhere else in any other cases. Or if you do see some of these things pop up in other cases, it's usually just one of the things that happened in this case and not all of the things that happen in this case. So I'm very interested by this case, and I'm very excited to kind of get into it and tell you guys about it just because there is so much that happens in it. So before we get started, I usually like to go into some background for the people involved in the case, but unfortunately I really don't have much of that for this case, so I'll give you what I have, which is not much. Okay, so the case takes place in Riverview, Florida, and the first person I want to mention in this case is going to be Kenyatta Baron. She was 33 years old and a mother of 2. She was born on November 13th, 1984 to Booker T. Ray and Carrie Lloyd. From what I could find, she was very religious and also very family oriented, very much about her kids, very much about her family, her mom, and stuff like that. The second person I want to talk about is going to be Ronnie O'Neal. She was 9 years old. She was autistic, nonverbal. She had trouble walking and sometimes used a wheelchair. And then we have Ronnie O'Neal the fourth, the son of Ronnie O'Neal the third. So that might get a little confusing throughout this video. I'll try to make sure I'm differentiating between the fourth and the third so you know exactly who I'm talking about. Or I'll say father or son or whatever. But yeah, so we have Ronnie O'Neal the fourth, who was 8 years old, and then we have Ronnie O'Neal the third, who was 32 at the time and the father of the family. So Ronnie O'Neal the third and Kenyatta Baron had been together at some point, clearly because they had children. But by this point, by the day that all this takes place, they were no longer together. And after speaking to, or some people had spoken to some of the neighbors and people who lived around them and stuff like that, a lot of people said that there were no signs of potential abuse or anything negative going on in the home. But apparently there were also some people who said that they had seen Ronnie threaten her before and that he had been seen yelling on the roof at one point or another. So yeah, like I said, I don't have much background for this, so we're kind of just gonna jump straight into the scene of the crime, or what was going on a little bit leading up to the crimes and everything. So yeah, there's really no great segue for that, so I'm sorry. I'm just gonna just kind of jump right into what happened that day. So the day that we're talking about is March 18th, 2018, and we are at the O'Neal home. So the first description that I have for the scene is that we see Ronnie O'Neal holding a shotgun and he's arguing with Kenyatta Baron. And they're just yelling back and forth at each other. Then Kenyatta Baron runs to her daughter Ronivia's room where Ronivia was sitting on the bed. Ronnie O'Neal then told his son Ronnie the Fourth to go in the living room and start walking or pacing back and forth or walking around and saying Allah Akbar. And so he did so. The son, Ronnie the Fourth, then walks back into the room where the rest of his family is, and I guess tries to grab the shotgun from his dad, and him and his dad are kind of just holding the shotgun together. Ronnie O'Neal then asks his son to go into the garage and try to find a hunting knife, which luckily Ronnie O'Neal the Fourth is not able to find at this time. Then Kenyatta Baron runs past her son, Ronnie O'Neal the Fourth, and goes outside, and Ronnie O'Neal the Third, the father, follows her with the shotgun. And this is where we see a 911 call placed by Kenyatta Baron at approximately 11:43 p.m. She's screaming, "I'm shot, help me please," and saying "I'm sorry" while crying. At this point, a neighbor's fiance actually hears all the commotion going on outside and decides to tell his family to stay inside while he goes and checks out what's happening out there. He then saw two people at the end of like a foyer or a foyer. Foyer? I would say foyer, right? Anyway, he saw two people at the end of like a hallway, and he saw Kenyatta Baron laying face down on the ground and Ronnie O'Neal standing over her with something, but he couldn't quite tell exactly what he was holding. Kenyatta Baron, but at this point appears to be unresponsive, and Ronnie O'Neal is just screaming, "You don't understand." The neighbor's fiance then tries to get Ronnie O'Neal to back away from Kenyatta Baron, and he just keeps saying, "You don't understand, she killed me," and then he decides to go back into his home. Ronnie O'Neal does. Like I said, at this point, Kenyatta Baron is not showing any signs of consciousness at all, and so the neighbor's fiance decides to stay out there with her until help arrives. So this is where we see a 911 call placed by Ronnie O'Neal at approximately 11:49 p.m. The whole call is about 6 minutes long. I don't have the entire clip, but I do have a little clip of it that I'm going to show you.
The night of the murders, deputies say he made a 911 call ranting about demons, calling Kenyatta by her nickname, Kiki.
911, what is your emergency?
Hey, I just been attacked by some white demons inside Kiki. Kiki, her name is Kiki, and she tried to kill me.
What's that?
This part, I mean, not that like what I just told you about wasn't graphic, but this part is also graphic, or a little bit more graphic than what I just told you about, so strap in. I feel just dumb whenever I say that because, like, I understand this is a true crime podcast, and, like, I understand that you can probably stomach what I'm about to get into, but I just like to give you a little bit of a warning, especially because it is about a child, a disabled child at that. So, yeah, this is it's a little heartbreaking. About after a minute or two, Ronnie O'Neal decides to go back inside the home. He goes to the garage and then goes back to Ronivia's room. He then struck Ronivia twice with an axe. He first hit her in her back, and then he hit her on her head. Ronnie O'Neal IV then saw a lot of blood coming from Ronivia and saw her eyes roll back in her head. Oh, I'm sorry. This didn't take place in Ronivia's room. It took place in Kenyatta Baron and Ronnie O'Neal's room, actually. He had dragged her there by her arm. Ronnie O'Neal then lit a match and some tissue and poured gasoline all over the house and threw the match, or threw the tissue, I guess, down onto where he had, like, a spot where he had put gas down. At this point, Ronnie O'Neal, the father, takes his son into the garage, where he then holds him down by his foot. Ronnie O'Neal III, the father, then again lights a match and some tissue and throws it down next to his son. So either right after that or right before that, Ronnie O'Neal had called someone on his cell phone, and yeah, I think we find out later that that's his father that he called. But anyway, Ronnie O'Neal IV is able to somehow get away, and he makes a break for the kitchen. Ronnie O'Neal III, his father, then follows him. Ronnie O'Neal then goes into one of the drawers and grabs a knife, and this is where Ronnie O'Neal IV, his son, ends up blacking out. We later find out that Ronnie O'Neal the father, attacked his son with that knife, and I'm not sure if he straight, like, full on, like, stabbed him, but, like, he at least, like, got a good, like, few slash marks in him and maybe even stabbed him. A little bit after that, Ronnie O'Neal IV kind of comes back to, and he runs outside and sees that all the cops and I think paramedics are there at this point. And at this point, Ronnie O'Neal IV, the son, is taken to the hospital, and Ronnie O'Neal III is arrested. Okay, so I feel like that was kind of a lot of information that I just covered. There's a lot of people involved in, like, a very short amount of time. A lot of people that get hurt or killed in a very short amount of time. So I want to take a little bit of time to actually go through all of the injuries and things like that, so we actually get a better picture on what exactly happened to Kenyatta, Ranivia, and Ronnie O'Neal IV. So I want to start with Kenyatta Baron. Her autopsy was done by Dr. Mary Mainland, a medical examiner at Hillsborough County. So Kenyatta Baron had a gunshot wound to her back right shoulder and also a bigger gunshot wound to her right elbow. And her arm was actually broken in 2 different places. Dr. Mainland said that these injuries are not actually the ones that would have killed her. She had many injuries to her head, including 15 lacerations, many abrasions and contusions to the left side of her head, 6 to 7 fractures on her face, including jaw, facial bones, behind her lip, and also many fractures to the base of her skull. She also had teeth missing, and her cause of death ended up actually being brain hemorrhaging as a result of blunt force trauma. Ranivia O'Neal's autopsy was also done by Dr. Mary Mainland at Hillsborough County. She had penetrating chop wounds and blade wounds to the head, neck, and torso, and also her foot. She also had fractures to her cervical vertebrae. I'm guessing just like her lower back. I think is what that would mean. She also had other head injuries like cerebral contusions. She also had a lot of burns on her body, and her cause of death ended up being homicidal violence. So Ronnie O'Neal IV did survive this, but he still had stab wounds to his neck, abdomen, and chest, and his like arms. He had burns to 30% of his body, and he also had to use a breathing tube in the hospital. A few days, or I'm not sure exactly how long, but a little bit after the attack or this tragedy or tragic event happened, some cops came and asked Ronnie O'Neal IV some questions about what happened, and he told the cops about everything that he could remember that happened that night. And then at some point he started to build a little bit of a relationship with one cop named Mike Blair and another one named Thomas Dirks. There was one night that Mike Blair came to visit Ronnie O'Neal IV in the hospital, and Ronnie then asked him if he would stay with him or come back at some point and watch a movie with him. And so he went home and talked to his wife about it, and then him and his wife actually ended up, I don't know if it was the same night or a different night, but they ended up coming back up to visit him and watch a movie with him. Ronnie also went to different things with Mike Blair and Thomas Dirks, like sports games and things like that. So since Ronnie O'Neal IV's mother was now deceased and his father was in jail, he had been appointed a state guardian for a little while, and that state guardian ended up calling Mike Blair and saying, "Hey, we need someone to foster him. Do you think that's something you would be able to do?" And so Mike went home, talked to his wife about it, and they prayed about it, and they ended up saying yes, that they would foster him. So that's one of the first interesting things that happens in this case. I saw another case not all that long ago where the same thing happened, where like a kid had been attacked by one of their family members or something like that, or just in a horrible situation. I can't remember exactly. But one of the cops involved in the case ended up like fostering and then adopting that child. So that's not something that like hasn't been seen before, but it's definitely not something that I've seen very often. So that's the first like interesting thing that happens in this case. I quite honestly didn't even know that they were able to do that, just because I thought it would be seen as like them interfering, I guess, or like trying to influenced the case, I guess, in a way. Not saying that like it shouldn't happen. I just honestly didn't think that it was something that they could do. But yeah, so that's like the first interesting thing that happened in this case, other than the fact that Ronnie O'Neal attacked his entire family. I personally find it super interesting when people attack their families, or kill their families, just because I always think that like it would be easier to attack someone or hurt someone that you don't know, rather than someone you're close with. But yeah, so that's one of, or well, I guess the second interesting thing that happens in this case. Okay, so there are actually a few things that I forgot to go over. One of them is the account of a firefighter named Donald Foster, who was on the scene of the crime. So he was actually one of the first responders to arrive at the scene, and when he got there, someone told him that there was a child still inside the home. And so when he went inside the home, there was just a fire everywhere off to his left, like consuming that side of the home. He then crawled to the back bedroom in the home where Ronivia was. He then got Ronivia out of the home. And once he took her outside, they realized that unfortunately she was already deceased. And he said that in that moment, all he could really do was just hold her and just cry. I also wanted to go over an account of Thomas Dirks, one of the cops that ends up having a little bit of a friendship with Ronnie O'Neal IV after everything happens. So he was another person that was one of the first ones to be there on the scene. And when he got there, he saw Kenyatta Baron laying on the ground, covered by a sheet. Although she was covered by a sheet, he was still able to see her gunshot wounds and the trauma that she had taken to her head and her body. He also found the shotgun that Ronnie O'Neal was once using in pieces next to her. So basically, she was shot twice, but he also beat her so hard that he broke the shotgun. I also just want to take a minute to discuss just how sad and tragic Ronivia's death is specifically. Not saying that Kenyatta's is not tragic and horrible as well, but there are some elements to Ronivia's that make it really gruesome and honestly pretty hard for me to talk about and even think about. And I feel like I may have kind of glazed over what happened to her earlier when I kind of went through like the basics of the story and the crime. And I feel like I also kind of minimized it by saying it's a little heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking. So I don't want to minimize that at all. And I want to take a minute to talk about that just a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier when I gave my little introduction about Ronivia, I said that she was autistic and nonverbal. And so with her, and she was also, she didn't walk very well or sometimes needed help and sometimes used a wheelchair. So with all of those disabilities in mind, thinking about her own father coming into her room while coming into her room, dragging her by her arm into a different room, and then proceeding to chop her in her back and then in her head with an axe, is just so horrifying to think about. Not only, like, this would be horrifying if it happened to anyone, but the fact that due to Ronivia's disabilities, she was not able to scream for help. She was not able to run away or probably defend herself in any real way, especially against someone so much bigger than her and stronger than her. And, you know, like I said, like any child, any person like that this would happen to, it would still be absolutely terrible. But just to think about that she couldn't even scream is just like really, really heartbreaking to me. And this wasn't something that I really kind of wrapped my head around until I was later watching some of like the court footage and stuff, and then the judge actually made that point that she wasn't able to run away or scream while she was being attacked. And I guess just actually realizing that part of it was just so terrible. But yeah, I wanted to take a minute just to really talk about just how fucking horrible that must have been for her, especially not only for something like that to happen to her, but for it to be done to her by her own father. So yeah. Also, I actually described a foyer as a hallway, and that's incorrect. It's actually defined as an entrance hall or other open area in a building by or used by the public, especially a hotel or a theater. So yeah, sorry I'm bad at knowing things. Anyway, so I want to go ahead and get into the pre-trial section of this case. The judge appointed to the case was Michelle Sisco, and Ronnie O'Neal III was charged with 7 separate charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, 1 count of arson, 2 counts of aggravated child abuse, and resisting arrest without violence. So, leading up to the actual trial, there was quite a bit of question about Ronnie O'Neal's sanity and whether he was going to be deemed competent to stand trial or not. So, Child Protection Services actually did quite a bit of interviewing with neighbors, parents, relatives, and others that knew the family, and they found nothing to suggest like abuse, mental illness, addiction, or any kind of erratic behaviors. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, most of the people around them, like their neighbors and family members, didn't really ever see anything like this coming. But there also were a select few that did see things like Ronnie getting up on the roof and yelling, and another person said that he had possibly threatened Kenyatta before. So as you can hear in the 911 call clip that I played earlier, and I think also in Kenyatta Baron's 911 call, it can be heard, which I'm not going to play hers just because it's pretty difficult to listen to. But anyway, you can definitely hear in both, like you can hear Ronnie O'Neal screaming about demons and saying that Kenyatta killed him, or even mentioning that he or even mentioning that she tried to kill him at some point. In Kenyatta Baron's 911 call specifically, you can hear him in the background yelling Allah Akbar. And some think that the original fight that could have started all of this could have been about religion. Because like I said, Kenyatta Baron was very religious, and meaning Christian. I don't know if I said that specifically. And I'm guessing here that Ronnie O'Neal was Muslim, or had a different religious opinion or religious belief than she did. So a lot of people, or some people, think that that could have been the catalyst for everything that happened on that night. Ronnie O'Neal at some point spoke out, I'm guessing in like pre-trial hearings, and said that the media was misrepresenting him as a menace. And not long after that, doctors declared him not competent to stand trial. He was then moved to a state hospital from the prison. So I don't really know what happened in between him being declared not competent to stand trial and then him now later being declared competent to stand trial. But at some point they changed their mind or something happened to where they reversed their original decision. On October 28th, 2020, Ronnie O'Neal filed a motion to dismiss the first count of first-degree murder. They later had a hearing for this motion to talk about this motion that he filed on December 3rd, 2020. So basically the story he's trying to spin here is that Kenyatta was the one who was actually trying to harm him and the kids, and that he murdered her in self-defense so that she wouldn't continue to try to hurt or kill him or the kids. So basically he's trying to get them to either take away that first charge of first-degree murder or lessen that charge of first-degree murder to like second-degree murder, and trying to say that he acted in self-defense. The prosecution then presented more than enough evidence to prove that he was not acting in self-defense. They used the testimony of the one neighbor who actually went outside to see what was going on and stayed with Kenyatta until help arrived. And he said that he heard screaming. He was the one that called the police and then stayed with her until they got there. They also have the 911 call placed by Kenyatta Baron where she's heard screaming, saying she's sorry and begging for her life, basically. They also have the testimony of Thomas Dirks, who was one of the first police officers to show up to the scene of the crime. And he was the one that saw the shotgun in pieces next to Kenyatta, insinuating, and later we find out that Kenyatta was beat so badly with the shotgun that it broke into pieces. Not saying that can't necessarily happen in self-defense, but that was a piece of evidence that they brought forward. They also spoke to Dr. Mary Mainland, who did the autopsy for Kenyatta Baron. And if, like I said, she had 15 different lacerations to her head. She had contusions, and her jaw was broken, I believe, other fractures and stuff on her face. I kind of just wanted to take a minute and point out that he did try to lessen his charges, or at least one of his charges, or even try to eventually lessen his sentence by getting an insanity plea, or going with an insanity plea. Or maybe not lessen, I guess, his sentence, but like get a different sentence or something like that, by trying to claim an insanity plea. To me, it kind of just goes to show just how heartless this guy is, because not only was he able to do all of this, but he was also able to try to, even before the trial even started, he tried to find some kind of way to kind of like make things better for himself. All right, so now I'm going to start with the beginning of the trial and the opening statements. As I mentioned earlier, he spends most of the time that he speaks in court just yelling at everyone in the courtroom. Here's a clip of that.
The evidence is going to show that we are under some of the most vicious, lying, fabricating, fictitious government you ever seen.
Okay, so I'm going to go through his argument and his opening statement so we can get a good idea of what exactly this guy was trying to argue. And then after that, I'll give you my little tidbit of what I think about it. And yeah. So he starts out by saying that the government is corrupt and that they're trying to paint him as some kind of menace. He calls them mass murderers and say that they tampered with evidence. He says that they tampered with evidence because they did not have enough evidence to make the jury believe that he would be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, so they made up some of their own. He then says the evidence will prove that his son did not see him kill his mom, or Kenyatta Baron, and that his son's story is inconsistent. He tries to point out inconsistencies among the 911 calls and what time they took place. He says that the prosecution the media makes it seem like that he said Allah Akbar more times than he actually did. He says the evidence will show that he loves his kids. He then says that the prosecution or the medical examiner got the type of bullet that was in part of Kenyatta Baron's arm incorrect. They said it was a pellet shot. They say it was a bird shot, and he says it wasn't. And he also makes the point that the other pieces of Kenyatta Baron's arm were never found. I have no idea what that's supposed to prove. He mentions that she was shot in the closet of their home, and he says that they put bullet holes, or they, like the prosecution or the cops or somebody, added holes to make it look like that he was aiming at her head. He then, in an effort to garner sympathy, said that Ronnie was born at only 3 pounds and she couldn't breathe on her own, and that him and Kenyatta fought while she was in the hospital to keep her alive, so it wouldn't make sense that he would want to kill her. And this is something that I really wish Kenyatta was here. Well, I wish Kenyatta was still here, period, because she didn't deserve to die, and definitely not the way that she did die. But this is something that I wish she was here to comment on, just because I would really like to know, like, how involved he was with Ron, if at all. And especially in that, like, urgent time of her life, I would really like to know what she would have to say about how Ronnie O'Neal was when she was in the hospital, when she was born and everything. And it also really just makes me wonder how he really felt about having to take care of a child with disabilities, because I know that cannot be easy, especially with a child who's nonverbal and also sometimes has to use a wheelchair. I mean, it just wouldn't be the easiest thing to do at all. So it just really makes me wonder how involved he really was and how much he really cared about Ronnie when she was here. Ronnie O'Neal then claims that this was a justified homicide in self-defense. He says that they won't be able to prove that it was premeditated, and he then calls Kenyatta's murder a heat of passion murder. which would qualify as a second-degree murder instead of a first-degree. He claims that Kenyatta was on drugs and was domestically violent towards him, and also had been born premature, like their daughter Ronnie. He then starts to talk about his son. He mentions his mental delays, says that he could have been coached because he was being fostered by Mike Blair, one of the police officers on the case. And he also mentioned that his story is going to be inconsistent. So I actually forgot to mention that Ronnie O'Neal is going to be the one representing himself in court. So basically being his own lawyer throughout the trial. So I just think it says a lot about a person to be able to attack your flesh and blood, like physically attack your flesh and blood, your child, and then have to turn around and verbally attack them and try to dismantle their story and their credibility. Not saying that's not what a lawyer should do, because that's absolutely their job, is to discredit witnesses and basically tear apart the prosecution's theories and their witnesses and their stories and everything. But I just think it says a lot about a person who's able to do something like that. Okay, so that was his opening statements. So now I'm going to get into a little bit of a critique of these statements and his arguments. Okay, so I'm going to start with what I think Ronnie O'Neal did well. And I mean that in the most disrespectful way possible. So I definitely think he did a good job with the pieces of evidence he was trying to pull out, because he's literally grasping at straws and trying to just use anything he has to try to disprove the prosecution's theory, or what the prosecution says happened. So I think him bringing up the phone records was one smart thing that he did, because basically he's trying to poke holes in their timeline and trying to say, like, they're trying to make it look like something happened at a time when it didn't actually happen. As absolutely horribly cruel as it is, attacking his son's credibility is, number one, necessary, and number two, very smart, because as you'll see later, Ronnie O'Neal the fourth, his son, is going to testify against him in this trial. So attacking his son's credibility is one of the smartest things he could do, from like a lawyer standpoint, from a tactical standpoint. So saying he has mental delays, he could have been coached by his foster parent, and saying that his story is inconsistent are all three good ways to try to kind of attack him and try to dismantle his credibility. He also, in my opinion, does a rather smart thing by accusing the government of being corrupt, because I think this is kind of a smart tactic, because I feel like we've seen, especially recently, I feel like it's been more widely covered, that Black people and Black men do end up taking the fall for things that they did not do, simply because of a racist system or a racist police department. So yeah, we definitely do see things like that happen quite often. So it's honestly not the dumbest thing for him to be like, the government's corrupt and they're making a story up about me. Clearly, I don't think that this is one of the cases that something like that happens. But it is a smart tactic, I guess, when you literally have nothing else. There definitely are other cases where local governments local police departments, local governments have tampered with evidence or just created evidence, such as the Making a Murderer case or the Stephen Avery case that I'm sure, if you're watching this, you probably know about that case. So if you remember, I mean, they made up evidence, they tampered with it, so I mean, it's not like it doesn't happen. So I think it was kind of a good idea for him to just kind of throw that in there with the phone records and stuff being inconsistent, as he says, or trying to poke that hole in their timeline. He also made another smart move by trying to garner sympathy with Ronivia's birth story and saying that they had to keep fighting for her to stay alive, and why would I want to kill her if we had to fight so hard for her to stay alive. And once again, I'm not trying to compliment him. I'm just trying to make a critique of his opening statements and his arguments, So yeah, I'm not trying to compliment him. So let's get into what didn't work out for him so well and what didn't necessarily benefit him. So even though he did find basically all that he could to try to make an argument out of against the prosecution, none of these things that he brings up are things that are important or things that I think would change a jury's mind in any way, shape, or form. The phone records, like I said, is something to grab at. It's something to bring up. I mean, it's, you do what you can when you have nothing else. But still, not a great piece of evidence. I mean, he basically only argued that the calls took place maybe a few minutes differently than what they were recorded from the prosecution. He also mentioned that they lied about the number of times that he hit her. Don't know why that would matter. You still beat her to death, so I don't know why he... again, it was something to bring up, but it doesn't change anything. Trying to make his son look like he's not a credible witness. Once again, something that he basically has to do, considering that he is going to testify against him later in the trial. But also, it's, in my opinion, watching him do that really didn't... if I were a jury member sitting back and watching him do that, I wouldn't think, good point. I would be like, oh man, this guy is literally ripping apart his kid that he already attacked, it just doesn't make you look good. And it, I get why he's trying to do it, but he's a child. Of course, the story is going to be a little inconsistent. It's a very traumatic event. He was 8 years old when it happened. He may remember things later on. He blacked out at one point that night. So, of course, the story is going to be a little inconsistent. It may be a little bit different every time you tell it. But once again, he's a kid. I feel like him trying to dismantle his credibility ended up just making him look bad. I feel like he really kind of did the best that he could with what he had, but none of these arguments were going to change the way that I think at least a jury was going to look at him and then end up making a decision for him. So I want to talk a little bit about the defense, the heat of passion, which would be a second-degree murder charge. So I looked around at a few different blogs ran by lawyers and law offices in the state of Florida, and they all describe heat of passion as a mental state provoked by fear, rage, anger, or terror that, combined with adequate provocation, is a defense to the crimes of first and second-degree murder. Provocation, in order to be adequate, must be such as might naturally cause a reasonable person in the passion of the moment to lose self-control and act on impulse without reflection. So I wanted to go over what heat of passion means, especially in the state of Florida. And I also want to kind of talk about exactly what kind of narrative he's trying to push here, and just kind of try to go over the story that he's trying to act like actually happened that night. Just because the way that he's trying to tell it, there was a lot of inconsistencies with the evidence that we actually have compared to the story he's trying to tell. So I just want to take a second to talk about that. So, like I mentioned earlier, the story that he's trying to sell here is that Kenyatta Baron was actually the one who was attacking the family and was the one that actually killed Ronnie, and that's why he ended up killing her in self-defense so that she wouldn't hurt the kids and him anymore. So here's all of the issues that I have with his story. Number one, we have a witness who literally saw him bludgeon Kenyatta Baron to death. We have the shotgun broken into multiple pieces. We have his own son as a witness, not cross-examining, but testifying against him in the trial. We have his intake photo where he's covered in blood, and as far as I know, there were no injuries on him when they took him in. We have the fire being set after Kenyatta Baron's death. So we don't have any witnesses that say they saw the fire before she died or anything like that. And also I would assume that had this fire been set by Kenyatta, it probably would have done a lot more damage to the home than it actually did. So we have the fire being set after her death. In his 911 call, he never sounds particularly panicked. You can hear him saying she tried to kill me, but he doesn't sound that upset about it. And then we also see that he never once mentions the kids in his 911 call. We have Kenyatta Baron sounding absolutely terrified in her 911 call. And so, yeah, like I said, like he's literally just grasping at anything he can at this point to try to make it seem like he didn't do this or somehow make the outcome of this better for him. And I don't know if he really thought this through, but by him defending himself, he not only lessens his chances of getting a better sentence and actually having someone represent him properly, but he's also just making himself look very cold and very narcissistic in a way. Like I feel like people are, especially like specifically killers who represent themselves in court, like that has to have something to do with narcissism. Like that's just like you don't think anyone could defend you better, like only you can do it. So I don't know if he really ever thought about how him defending himself, not only defending himself, but screaming at everyone in the courtroom the entire time, was going to make him look. But I really don't think it did him any justice. I also don't think that him being able to cross-examine his son does him any justice at all. Like I said, he does smart tactical things with it, with the way he represents himself in court, but at the same time, it just kind of puts himself at a disadvantage, in my opinion. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get into like the meat of the trial. We've basically already covered all of the witnesses that the prosecution calls, being the firefighter, Donald Foster, one of the police officers, Mike Blair, and another police officer, Thomas Dirks. And so finally, they call their key witness to the stand, Ronnie O'Neal IV. So I'm not going to go super in depth with his testimony, mainly because most of his testimony I actually used to get the story of what happened that night. A lot of that comes from the prosecution talking to him in court and trying to figure out exactly what he saw and exactly what happened. So I'm not going to go over that again. But I am going to get a little bit into the cross-examination between Ronnie O'Neal III and Ronnie O'Neal IV. I'm also not going to go super in-depth with that because honestly, he didn't do a great job. So there's really no need to. So Ronnie O'Neal III just spends a lot of time going back and forth between two main documents that he's going to pick out details from and ask his son about. One of them being a forensic interview with Jennifer Miller, and the second one being a deposition done with Thomas Dirks about a year ago from the day they were in trial. So Ronnie O'Neal III spends most of his time nitpicking very tiny details about different things that Ronnie O'Neal said in the interview with Jennifer Miller and the deposition with Thomas Dirks, trying to show some inconsistencies between them. But honestly, they're pretty minor details. And like I said, they could be things that are easily could have been changed or like remembered later on just because of trauma and his age. So I'm just going to give a few examples of that. So Ronnie O'Neal III asks his son if he ever saw him beat or shoot Kenyatta Baron. His son says no. Ronnie O'Neal III then references the interview with Jennifer Miller where his son said that he saw and heard him do both, and Ronnie O'Neal IV says that he doesn't remember. Ronnie O'Neal III then asks his son, "I stabbed you?" and his son says yes. Ronnie O'Neal III then references the deposition with Thomas Dirks, where Ronnie O'Neal IV said that his dad hurt him a different day, and then Ronnie O'Neal IV then says that he doesn't remember. Ronnie O'Neal III then asks his son if Ronivia was shot. His son says no, and that she was hurt after that. Ronnie O'Neal then references the interview with Jennifer Miller, where Ronnie O'Neal IV said that Ronivia was hurt before he heard the shot, and Ronnie O'Neal IV then says that he doesn't remember. So yeah, it's basically just like a good, 20 minutes or so of them doing that. And in my opinion, Ronnie O'Neal IV making no good points, really. Other than he's cold enough to be able to sit there and question his child about him hurting him and his family. So Ronnie O'Neal III then calls two witnesses of his own. One of them says he saw Kenyatta Baron running away from Ronnie O'Neal III, and then he saw Ronnie O'Neal III beat her and shoot her. Don't know how that helped your case. The second one being Billy Smith, Ronnie O'Neal's father. Billy Smith said that Ronnie O'Neal told him that Kenyatta Baron was trying to kill him. He then rushed over to the home and found that responders were already there, and I guess he spoke to one of the firefighters who told him that the fire was set intentionally. Okay, so I'm going to go through his closing arguments, but honestly, they're basically the same as his opening statements. He's still saying that the prosecution is trying to lie on him, saying that he hit Kenyatta more times than he actually did. He references one of the witnesses he called, who was 14 at the time of the incident, and is basically trying to say, like, why would they call his son Ronnie O'Neal IV and not this neighbor? Because Ronnie was younger than the neighbor was at the time, which is just such an invalid argument. Ronnie O'Neal IV is a much more relevant and closer witness to the actual crime that happened. I really don't feel like there was a need to call the witness that he called, especially because they had another neighbor's testimony as well. Again, points out some inconsistencies in Ronnie O'Neal IV's story. He again mentions the call logs and how they weren't exact down to the very minute of when he says that he called the police or Kenyatta Baron called the police. Again, trying to push his narrative that Kenyatta Baron killed Ronnie and was the one attacking the family. He again tries to show that there's some kind of conflict of interest between the police department and this case, because Mike Blair fosters Ronnie O'Neal IV and hung out with him and took him to different sports games and things like that before the trial. Which, again, I know he's just trying to do this for his own benefit, but honestly, how dare you speak ill of someone who just took your son in and is taking care of him and is making sure he's okay and doing all these things for him that he doesn't have to do, spending time with him off the clock. Like, I get what you're trying to say, but like, come on, fam. Like, really? Also, the fact that he's trying to sit there and be like, oh, this man adopted and spent time with my son and fostered my son just so he could coach him to testify against me in court. Like, that is so crazy. You know, like, that is so crazy for you to think that someone would go through all of that work just to put you behind bars when basically it was an open and shut case from beginning, whether Mike Blair was going to help Ronnie O'Neal IV or not. Like, it's just so... That narrative to me is so insane. Also, I firmly believe if you were to come in contact with this kid who had just been through this horribly traumatic event and they asked you, hey, will you come back sometime and watch a movie with me? Like, are you really going to say no? Like, for real? Like, unless it's, like, completely against, like, unless his department was like, hey, like, we can't do that. It would be interfering with the case or something like that, then I might understand. But, like, if you don't have anything stopping you from doing that, are you really going to be like, nah, kid, I'm not going to do that? Like, come on, man. He then finishes out his closing arguments or closing statements by showing Ronivia's picture after she had died, once again trying to garner sympathy with Ronivia, completely unnecessary. Also, I feel like it was really gross to me that he did that because he was the one who killed her, and so for him to get up there and be like, oh, look at this, look what happened to our family, like, fam, you did that to your family, like, why are you, you know, like, why? It just seemed completely unnecessary to me when I watched that footage. And I honestly kind of felt really bad for everyone who was there who had to see that picture again, because they may have shown it, I'm guessing, earlier, just in the evidence and everything. But having to see it again just because this guy wants to be dramatic and garner sympathy, like, I felt bad for everyone in that courtroom in that moment. So I want to start off the prosecution's rebuttal and their closing arguments by showing you this clip of the prosecuting attorney finally getting his chance to get up there and do his closing arguments, just because he looks so done with everything going on in this case. He's like, I am so done with this man, and I just want to get this finished. And it's just so funny because Ronnie O'Neal spends, I would say, like, I don't know, 20 minutes just regurgitating everything he's already said earlier in the trial, and his closing arguments, and then this man gets up here for all of like 5 minutes and just completely like destroys his case. So yeah, here's that clip.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I promise I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I know it's already been a long day, but I feel like it's necessary to point out at least some of the more absurd points that the defendant made in his closing argument.
So in his closing argument, the prosecuting attorney repeats that Ronnie O'Neal already admitted to killing Kenyatta Baron, and he's like, what else do we need to prove other than that? He already admitted to it. He also mentions that Ronnie O'Neal IV was 8 years old at the time, and by the time they had gone to trial, this event happened 3 years ago. So it's definitely not uncommon for him to remember things or change things throughout different interviews about what happened that night over the span of 3 years when he's that young. He addresses the phone records, and with Ronnie O'Neal saying that they tried to redact the phone records or change the time of them. He says his argument is basically invalid because they played the 911 calls in court. So, like, what would be the point of trying to redact them, like, on paper? And he also said that if they were going to, like, meddle with or change the phone records, why would they change them in a way so that Ronnie O'Neal could make an argument out of them? Like, why would they change them so that it would work out in his favor? Also, I just wanted to say that the fact that Ronnie O'Neal thinks that this police department would go through all of this work to try to frame him just to make the crime look worse than it actually was doesn't really make any sense at all. Because I mean, not that it couldn't happen or hasn't happened. I don't know that it has, but like I definitely know that police departments have framed people, but usually, at least in the examples I've seen, they're like completely like making it up. Like they're completely framing someone, completely making up evidence. Out of nowhere. It's usually not just like, oh, we're just gonna make this a little bit worse for him. Like it was already, in this case, it was already an open and shut case, in my opinion. They have really no reason to try to make it worse for him. It just doesn't make any sense that they would do that. The prosecution also mentions, so at some point Ronnie O'Neal tries to say that you could hear a fire alarm in the background of either his or Kenyatta Baron's 911 call. And the prosecution is like, we don't hear a fire alarm. We hear something, but and I listened to it. It doesn't sound like a fire alarm. It sounds like something in the background, but like we all know what like a house smoke detector fire alarm sounds like. It doesn't sound like that. So the prosecution addresses that they did not hear a fire alarm in the background because he was basically trying to claim that the fire was set before Kenyatta Baron's death, and that just didn't work out for him. So, all right, so now I'm going to go ahead and get into the verdicts that the jury delivered. So the jury came back saying that he was guilty on all 7 counts. Ronnie O'Neal has absolutely no reaction to this, which is probably something they told him to do, was to have no reaction either way. But absolutely no reaction to this, and then the judge dismisses the jury, or at least like for that day. So the judge, Michelle Sisco, then explains to Ronnie that they're going to be going into the penalty phase.
Okay, everyone, have a seat. So Mr. O'Neal, now that you have been found guilty of first-degree murder, we now go into penalty phase. And as you are aware, it gets no more serious for any defendant in any criminal courtroom in this country than what you are facing now. I respect the fact that you chose to represent yourself, and I have to tell you, I think in another lifetime, you would have been an excellent lawyer. I really think that. You speak with great passion. I understood exactly the points you were making. I knew what you were attempting to get across in your opening statement, your cross-examination of the state witnesses, the direct examination of your witnesses in your closing argument. Ultimately, your arguments were not persuasive to the jury, but nonetheless, I was able to follow exactly what you were trying to accomplish. However, as we move into penalty phase, I'm really going to strongly encourage you to consider allowing counsel to now step in and represent you.
As you saw there, you can hear her complimenting his work as a lawyer or as representing himself in court. Says he could have been a lawyer at some point or in another lifetime. Says his arguments were not persuasive, but she still got what he was trying to say and what points he was trying to make. She then encourages him to let lawyers help him from this point on. So the jury ends up recommending life. The decision for death had to be unanimous, and they just could not get there. So now we're going to get into the sentencing phase, and in this little clip that I'm about to show you, we're going to see Ronnie O'Neal give some thoughts about what he thought about the trial and just kind of everything going on in this situation. And then we're going to see Michelle Sisco give her thoughts about this case, and And it's just really interesting to see someone, especially a judge, give this much feedback, I guess, of just their personal opinion on something like this. I've personally never seen a judge do this. So it's just really interesting to watch. So yeah.
I am not sorry for something I didn't do, and I am not sorry for the things I did do.
Mr. O'Neal,
All right.
Listen, stop.
All right.
Listen to me.
I'm not
going to raise your voice again.
I'm not going to raise my voice again. I'm not.
I will have you removed from this courtroom. I can sentence you without you being present.
Yes, ma'am.
You don't conduct
I
yourself.
understand, Your Honor.
Thank you.
But I will say, I'm sorry for your loss.
There's a part of you that can be very charming and very likable. And with all due deference to your counsel, they're all excellent lawyers. But I have to tell you, I think that your representation of yourself also aided in saving you from the death penalty. I really do. I really think that.
Oh, praise.
I could be wrong, but that's just my best guess. However,
Thank you.
well, you're welcome, Mr. O'Neal. I'm just telling you the truth as I see it. However, 19 years I've been at this job. I've seen human beings killed at the hands of others in every way imaginable. You name it, I've seen it. Shootings, stabbings, drownings, suffocatings, blown apart by cars in DUI manslaughter cases. Horrible things. This is the worst case I have ever seen as far as the facts go. When the person from fire department, when he testified, and when he said that he retrieved the body of Ronnie O'Neal from the home, and all he could do was sob. It took every ounce I had not to start sobbing too. Because there is no way any person with any feeling could have witnessed or seen the photos of what occurred that night and not be haunted for the rest of your life. I know I will be. For the rest of my life, I'll be haunted by what I saw as far as the evidence and just the abject cruelty of it all. The abject cruelty. And I was aware, because I reviewed a lot of the discovery ahead of time, as you well know, did a lot of in-camera inspection of a lot of documents. And I was aware there was some evidence, at least, that when you needed to recover from your gunshot wound, that neither your parents nor your Aisha, Miss Robinson, would let you come recover at their home. I don't know if it's true or not. I'm not going to get into a dispute. I'm just mentioning there was some evidence referencing that in the records. And all I could think about, because I knew that Miss Baron was not with you romantically at the time. And I knew that she just out of the goodness of her heart let you come stay with her. And it is beyond tragic that that critical decision ended in so much horror for her and for her children. It is unspeakably cruel what happened as a result of that one decision. The way that Ms. Baron died was horrific, and that 911 call, which captured truly all of it. You heard, and everyone who's heard that 911 call heard a death scream. If anybody ever wants to know what it sounds like before a human being dies, knowing that their death is imminent, that's exactly what it is. That was a death scream. But what happened to little Ronivia and to little Ronnie, but I'm going to focus on Ronivia, because she was special. And you can tell Miss Baron had done everything she could to create a beautiful home for her family. I noticed that the Ronivia's bedroom, before you set it on fire, you could tell she tried so hard to make her feel like a princess. Kenyatta did everything she could. And I noticed too in the kitchen, on the refrigerator, she put up magnets that said faith, love, family, hope. And then you know what else happened at the refrigerator during that night? It got splattered with blood all over it due to what happened. Little Ronivia, she couldn't scream, she couldn't run away, and she witnessed what you did to her mother as far as shooting her mother in the arm with the gunshot. She knew. And the horror that that child suffered. And she already had a life where she was born with challenges regarding her physical and her mental disabilities. But the pain and suffering that she suffered that night at your hands, unspeakable, absolutely unspeakable. And at the moment, that first time you struck her with that hatchet, and little Ronnie testified that all he could see was tears coming out of his sister's face. At that moment, that child knew, she knew she was being betrayed in the cruelest, most tragic and sorrowful way that a child could ever be betrayed. She was being betrayed by her parent, the one person that should be there to protect their children and love them and keep them from harm. And that was the last thing that child felt before she passed on from this earth, was your utter, cruel betrayal to her. And I read somewhere, and I don't know if it's true or not, I have no idea, but I read somewhere that souls pick their lives, and that they know exactly how difficult their lives are going to be before they enter into this world. And I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, Ronnie O'Neal is one of the bravest souls I have ever come across in my 54 years on this planet. One of the bravest ever, ever, because she suffered so traumatically. So, Mr. McNair, I appreciate your comments about, do you still hear, maybe behind that pillar. I appreciate your comments about your own sentiments with the legal system, and I would never tell you it's perfect, it's not. But I'm going to look you in the eye and tell you, this is the worst case ever, ever in my life, and I have seen some horrors. But this is it, and I'm going to mete out the punishment that I think this case deserves.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the judge and what she had to say near the end there. I have never understood why some judges will compliment killers, specifically killers that represent themselves in court. I mean, I saw it the first time in the Bundy case, which I don't know if you remember, but the judge at the end of the case was like, you would have made a great lawyer or something like that. So I can't understand Michelle Sisco sitting there and being like, you can be very charming and very whatever. And, just saying that he could have been a lawyer in a different life, and that the way he posed his arguments, or the way that he, carried himself throughout the trial may have saved him from the death penalty. I just don't understand it. Like, I don't understand the need for it. I don't understand why you would want to stroke his ego that way. I don't get it. I just don't even see a point. Like, why? Like she's literally complimenting him on the way he carried himself in court when he was having to defend himself, because he killed his 9-year-old disabled child and his mother of his children. And I know that, I guess maybe by giving that critique of his opening statements, I maybe did the same thing by being like, this is what he did well, this is what he did well. But hopefully I tore that down at the same time, like immediately after. I was like, well, this was good, but also like pretty much irrelevant. I also feel like it means more coming from the judge. So I just don't understand why she would want to stroke his ego that way. I just don't get it. Maybe they're doing something for a reason that I just don't understand. I also think it's interesting that she would compliment him on the way that he carried himself throughout trial, because there were many times where she had to tell him to stop yelling or to not use certain language, or she had to tell him to specifically cite what document he was talking about, what page, that kind of thing, so they could keep up with him when he was talking. So it wasn't like he did a great job. Like, she still had to coach him through it and kind of help him through the entire trial and be like, hey, don't do this, or hey, you can't do that at this time, or whatever. And I have a few clips of that I'm going to show you.
Mr. O'Neal, you need to speak audibly so that the jury can hear what you're saying.
Yes, ma'am, I haven't begun yet. I was talking to my father. He showed you a fraudulent recording where they allege that I beat Kenyatta Baron to death. He talked about Mr. Khalil Brown, my neighbor who stayed across the street. But if Mr. Khalil Brown was a help to them proving me guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, they would have called Mr. Khalil Brown. But I called Mr. Khalil Brown to be a witness for me. And I didn't ask him to lie about one thing that he saw that night. I asked him to tell the jury exactly what he saw that night. And you have to ask yourself why that is. Because he's playing a fraudulent damn recording of me beating Kenyatta Baron 15 damn times when that did not happen. And like I told you earlier, you will know the truth, whether in this trial or the next one. Better believe it. If you think I'm here to play around with y'all, God damn it or not.
All right, Mr. O'Neal, please stop using swearing language. It's not appropriate in a closing argument.
Now he played a recording that was sped up. Why didn't you play the regular recording that people can understand what the call was saying?
Objection to the defendant asking me questions, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain.
I'm talking to people.
Mr. O'Neal, listen, please just keep in mind this is not personal towards the prosecutors. Please keep your comments directed towards the evidence and the law. Thank you.
I know for a fact Kenyatta Baron recording from her phone did not record calls sped up like that.
I'm going to object now when he's talking about facts, not in evidence of what he knows.
Again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you were instructed, the closing arguments are just that. They're not the evidence or the instruction on the law. It's just what the parties believe the evidence shows or does not show. All right? Thank you.
And you told them, Mr. Gale told you, after beating Kenyatta Baron, I told my son, or I said, the kids is mine now, bitch. Ronnie, sit the fuck down before I beat your bitch ass nigga, or I kill your bitch ass nigga. It's a bunch of bullshit.
Okay, Mr. O'Neal, please. I'm not going to warn you again. Stop using offensive language unless you're quoting directly from the evidence.
They told you that my phone was damaged in a fire. I know for a fact when I got arrested,
I'm going to sustain the objection. Again, you're limited to the facts that were introduced at this trial and your closing argument.
Did testify that it was burned in fire.
Mr. O'Neal, please don't argue with me. Just follow my instructions, all right?
Then you know that part of that was legitimate.
And again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, your recollection of the evidence controls, all right? This is just the closing argument of the sides. You may proceed, Mr. O'Neal.
Thank you, Your Honor. I made a call to 911. Supposedly, they made it look like I made a call at 2349. I know for a fact I made it early.
Judge, objection again to what the defendant knows.
I'm going to sustain the objection again, Mr. O'Neal. You can only argue in closing argument facts that were elicited at trial. This is not where you come in and start filling in additional facts.
Yes, ma'am.
And you've been instructed about this numerous times. Please follow my instructions.
Okay, Your Honor. Couple of things. He said that it was an actual fact that I killed my daughter. That's not an actual fact. That was proven in trial. I didn't object, but neither did they stop. You stopped them.
Mr. O'Neal, please don't argue with me.
I'm not arguing.
Please just direct your closing statement to the jury. That's what you need to be doing, not arguing with me.
Right.
I also don't understand how she's able to compliment someone who cross-examined their son that they attacked and tried to kill. Like, I can't wrap my mind around that. Like, as hard as I've tried, like, I try to look at it from every angle that I can think of, and I just can't understand why she would do that. It's even stranger that she gave all these compliments and then followed it up with, "This is the worst case that I've ever seen." Granted, the judge did really let him have it and tell him just how horrible she thought this crime was, and I definitely applaud that. Not that it like I said, I've never seen a judge do that before, so not that it was necessary. But I definitely do applaud her for sitting there and being like, "Hey, this was horrible." So I'm not trying to take anything away from her by saying why did you compliment this man on this? But at the same time, I could have done without the compliment and just gotten the critique. Like, if she would have just left the compliment to the side and just given her thoughts, or not her critique, but her thoughts on how horrible this crime was, I feel like that would have been more fitting for what happened in this case. I just can't understand her sitting there and being like, "Hey, this crime is the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my career, but also you did a good job representing yourself." Okay. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the aftermath of this case. Obviously, Ronnie O'Neal III goes to jail. He's still there, as far as I know, and probably won't be getting out. I think he talks a little bit about an appeal. We'll see if that happens. We'll see how it goes if it does happen. And if it does happen, maybe I'll cover it. I don't know. So yeah, he's in jail. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the comments that I was able to find from Kenyatta Baron's family and how they feel about the trial and their loss of her and Ronnie. So I want to start with Carrie Lloyd, Kenyatta Baron's mother. I saw an interview a while back that she did in an article where she said that she feels empty without her granddaughter and her daughter, and that Ronnie O'Neal will be miserable behind those bars, and that he'll wish that he was dead. There was also a comment from Kenyatta's sister, and she said that although this wasn't the outcome that they necessarily saw coming, it is still a win for them. And I would have to agree with her. I definitely, just based off of the bigger things that happened in this case, I definitely would have predicted that it would have been a death penalty case. Although since the decision for the jury to make that decision, it had to be unanimous, I understand that that decision can be a little hard to come by sometimes. As I mentioned earlier, Ronnie O'Neal IV was adopted by Mike Blair and his family. They also have 5 other children, and he says that they take great care of him. And I just wanted to say that I am so happy for him and the outcome of this case for him specifically, just because it seems like he has a supportive family that is here for him now. And it seems like Mike Blair was a good friend to him before he was even a good, dad to him. So it just makes me really happy that he didn't have to go through the system and possibly deal with even more trauma from going through the system. And I just really hope that now that all of this is over, I hope that he can just take time to just rest and just be a kid to the best of his ability. Obviously, I know this is probably going to affect him for the rest of his life, and his childhood probably won't be much like a normal, so to speak, childhood. But I just hope that he can have fun and just hang out and just be a kid and not have to worry about really much of anything right now. I also just wanted to mention, I hate to call him brave or strong, because none of this should have ever happened to him, and he shouldn't have had to deal with any of this. But just what a brave kid. Not only to survive all of that happened that night, but then to stand his ground and be cross-examined and testify against his own father in court. I mean, what a brave kid. I can't imagine having to be in that position and having to deal with that at all. And I mean, I know that the prosecution probably was like, hey, we really need you as this witness, like you're our key witness. So I'm sure that they were like, hey, like we need you to testify. And I understand that, but I mean, there are many people still to this day who are afraid to testify against their abusers and stuff like that. So I'm just, I know I don't know him, but I'm very proud of him. I can't imagine having to do that. And the fact that he, not only was he able to get up there on the stand and talk about all of this stuff, he did it very calmly. He didn't get upset. Not that like if he would have gotten upset, I completely would have understood. I'm just saying he really held his own, even as a kid in the courtroom. And I look up to that, honestly. I mean, I don't know that I could have done that at his age, and if I had gone through the same thing he's been through. All right, so now I just want to go ahead and get into some final thoughts I have about this case. So the fact that this case didn't get more attention really surprises me. Like I said, there have been at least a couple clips that I've seen that have gotten millions of views. So it's not like people don't know about this case at all. But at the same time, I haven't seen any national coverage of it that I can think of. And for what I can really remember, most of the clips and everything I've seen about it have just been on YouTube. So it's just really odd to me that this case didn't get more coverage and more attention just because of all the things going on in this case. Like I said, we have someone killing their family members and attacking their family members. We have a 9-year-old disabled child who's killed by her father. We have a killer representing himself in court, a killer cross-examining his victim who also happens to be his son, and then we have the killer's son being adopted by one of the detectives who worked on the case. I would say just one of any of these things usually I feel like would be easily seen, easily getting national coverage. I honestly believe that had this happened to a white family, this would have been plastered on every major news source that covers things like this. And I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm just saying, when things happen to black people compared to white people, it gets much less coverage. And it's hard for me to believe that if something like this happened to a white family, that everyone wouldn't know about it. I mean, it would probably be a household case, household known case. Everyone would know about it, had it happened to a white family. I mean, I remember when the Christopher Watts case happened, that was plastered on every major news source. And granted, his wife was pregnant with another baby. I understand that adds a different element to the story, but at the same time, with all of these things going on in this case, it just really surprises me that everyone doesn't know about it. And maybe more people know about it than I think, but it didn't get the coverage that I thought it would have just because of all the things going on in it. All right, so that's all that I've got for this one, folks. Thank you so much for sticking with me throughout this very long video, or podcast episode. If this is your first time watching me, thank you so much for being here, or your first time listening to me, thank you so much for being here. And if you have been here with me through either the blog or just when the podcast was just the audio version, thank you for coming back and sticking with me. Like I said in the beginning, I really can't explain to you guys how excited I am to get this video out. It's been a long time coming and a lot of work put into it, and I'm just so happy to even be at this point. And remember, ask questions, investigate things for yourself, and draw your own conclusions. In other words, don't follow the herd.